episode of Reptile Fight Club. You got me and Rob again today, so we're getting through the holiday season. We got the 4th of July today, so we figured let's get a show out. And how you doing, Rob?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I know you got some travel and things coming up, so it was great to. We said, hey, let's put in one more. There's a topic that arose on social media that we'll address in a future episode, but we wanted to make sure we give that one enough time to digest properly, and we'll be ready to go for that one. So everyone can look forward to that. But yeah, excited for today. All good.
Yeah, it should be a good time. I'm a little worn out. I've been up all night trying to do some construction around the house, replacing my flooring and stuff. So hopefully I'm not dragging too much this morning, but happy 4th of July. I'm sure it's a little belated for everybody listening to this in podcast land, whenever you, when is when or what is when, whatever, how you want to look at that. But if you're not in the U.S., you don't probably care about the 4th of July more than any other day. So this is just going out to our U.S. peeps. And I apologize. There's some construction in the yard next to me, so you might hear some hammering and sawing and things. I'm not sure what they're doing back there, but it's pretty close to our window. So hopefully it's a nice little structure they're putting up.
Right. Seems all right for now. I don't really hear it, but
okay.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be all good. Maybe they're just paying you back for last night.
Yeah, probably so. Yeah, I was up till about 1:30 finishing my bedroom floor. So it's taking shape. I just have a few finishing touches, and then we should be good to go. So I hate carpet. Which is strange because I'm a big carpet python fan, but I don't like carpet in my home, especially with a lot of pets. It's not a good mix. But All right. Well, how's your season going? I saw you had some eggs recently, huh? I don't know if you want to talk publicly or if you're saving that or.
Yeah. No, that's all right. I did get some good rhino eggs, which is exciting, effectuation on the transition to those display cages and all that. But kind of the surprise was, how many. So it was an older female, and she wound up having 13 small to medium eggs. Generally speaking, they'll lay 6 or 7 large ones. Mm-hmm. And if there are a few more, they can, it's not the most I've had previous. I have had 17 in one clutch before. So not the highest that I've had, but they all look really good. It was interesting. I don't usually get, that look where they have strings between the eggs, like the real tiny filament. It almost looks like dental floss style. A couple of the eggs had that feature, which is something I don't think I've really seen with them before. So that was interesting. And we'll see how they go.
Yeah, well, that's cool. Congratulations. I've thought about that a little bit because I remember when we were writing the first edition of the carpet book, we were talking, Ben's chapter was talking about, sometimes females will have fewer larger eggs and sometimes smaller and more numerous eggs. And I can't remember the impetus, like what promotes one over the other or how that works. So it's kind of an interesting thing. And especially you said that you saw smaller clutch from her in previous years as compared to now. So that's, any changes that you've made other than the caging? Maybe that's what
I don't know. No, I would have to, so I think the thing that I've been doing more has been offering more quail. So that's kind of interesting. That would probably be the biggest distinct change.
Yeah.
And as I say, I've had, large clutches before from other ones without those manipulations and things. Just sort of interesting that, for this iteration, she went with more smaller eggs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know which I would prefer. Do you like the smaller baby? I mean, I assume that translates into smaller babies.
Oh yeah, they'll be quite small for sure. No, probably not. But it is what it is. So you just got to be happy about that.
For sure. Yep. I guess we deal with challenges either way, but it's kind of nice to have more sometimes, at least, depending on, how many you already have it you're trying to sell or something like that. I guess doing things responsibly. And I haven't put my Brettles together because I still have some babies I need to sell from previous years. So, I try not to flood the market, as you might I mean, it's hard to flood the market in the U.S. with a clutch or two, but you'd be surprised on some of these things, I guess. But it seems like there's a few Brettles. I mean, they're really cool snakes, so I understand their popularity, but I guess they do have fairly large clutches in comparison with other similarly sized snakes, and so imagine it's easy to produce quite a few. And then you've got some full-time breeders that, that's their favorite project. So they've got lots of Brettles and producing lots. And in the name of morphs, you even have a higher production rate with, if you're trying to hit specific combinations of mutations and things. So yeah, it seems like there's a lot of Brettles available, but then again, I don't really advertise mine very well. So yeah, but they're really cool snakes.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you see on Instagram the guy goes by the handle FNQ_herpetology? Mm-hmm. He had posted from several years ago. Like I think that trip was several years ago, right? He'd gone to Alice or he was in McDonnell Ranges or whatever. Yep. But he's got the picture and then the little GoPro shot of finding a Brettles in the morning after seeing a DOR, and what he was kind of nonplussed, and then he put in a bunch of work and there it was, and just the palpable excitement was pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm excited for that day. I hope that day comes sooner than later. I'd love to see a wild Brettles for sure. I guess, it's a little bit of luck, but, putting in the time, getting yourself in the right location, definitely, you can't do it without doing that. So
absolutely.
Next year's trip will hopefully make that happen. We'll have to see. But that's going to be a big focus, I think, for me, is finding a Brettles in the wild. That'll be knock off another python species. And
absolutely.
If we can get a few this coming trip, that would be nice too. A few new ones. I won't say the name, but you guys can say it because you've seen them. But now that was one of my buddies. He wouldn't say Owen Pelly python because he thought it jinxed him for seeing them.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, he went several years without seeing any, and then all of a sudden he saw like 3 within a couple weeks. It's like they just come out of the woodwork all of a sudden. And why? Right? And why so infrequently? And that's kind of a crazy thing. It seems like that was the year you guys saw one was similar to that, where a lot of people had seen on. Yeah,
that's kind of what was just coming to my mind as you said that, is like, it does seem like there are years where you see them more often. And, kind of before our trip, I was then wondering if that was a bad sign in the sense of, they're all the ones that could possibly be seen are getting seen or whatever, with a handful. Yeah. As you say, within 2 or 3 months beforehand. But seemingly not. I need to look and see, are people probably not right now, but as we inch closer, it'll be interesting to see whether whether we see that same, rate of incidence that we saw in 19.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a publication, I think, on, trying to correlate increased findings with different environmental conditions and things like that. So, I guess that
interesting
feeds into what we're going to be talking about today in regards to temperatures and, natural cycles and things. But hopefully we get lucky and this is another big year for them and they're out and about. And if not, hopefully we get very lucky, even more lucky, and see one on a difficult year. But I can't remember the frequency or kind of the cycle that they were talking about with how frequently these increased observation periods occur, if it was like every 3 years or every 5 years or something like that, but I don't recall.
Right. I guess this would be 5 years. That's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Isn't that weird to think about? Like, yeah. When I was, when I was doing my first trip in a long time last year, it was like, 20, 23 3 and I hadn't been since 2016. So,
Yeah.
it was fun to get back there. I'm excited to continue that on, get back again. Yeah. I've been spending a lot of time setting up Antaresia and washing out Antaresia caging and such. So I have a few more than I thought I did. So I filled up one rack and am making some progress on the other rack. So I can't remember a count, but one of the clutches had 15 babies. So, I have 4 or 5 clutches and there's still one in the incubator. So yeah, it's going to be a fun little challenge here soon. But all my other groups or types crashed. I didn't get any carpet eggs that made it the distance. I missed that clutch of inland eggs and just kicking myself over that one. And then the Aspidites eggs all crashed. So I'm thinking it's caging. So I'm moving, towards and maybe temperature regimen, which again feeds into our discussion today. But
right.
I'm planning on switching up their caging to try to improve that a bit. So see if that helps. But
absolutely.
Yeah, these it can be frustrating sometimes when you think you've got it figured out and then you get thrown a loop and you think, how have I not figured it out better by this point?
Right.
But I guess I have my attention going in a lot of different directions. So at least the Antaresia are pretty straightforward and not really throwing me for many loops, but yeah.
Awesome.
So yeah, there's some really cool ones. I've got this really weird, kind of aberrant striped Eastern Stimson's python that I'm really geeked out about. It's really cool looking. So I'm excited to see how that one will turn out and see how this pattern will develop as it matures, but really cool looking snakes. So
that's great.
Yeah. These are probably, I think they're my third kind of selective breeding generation. So they're,
okay.
These Easterns are getting nicer and nicer. They're fantastic looking. So I got one clutch of the really nice, red, crazy looking Easterns. And then I got another clutch of this, black-eyed morph, Stimson's python that I'm working with that just kind of randomly popped out. I think I've told the story before, but I had an animal that I sold. And then the guy who bought it said, hey, this thing looks weird. It keeps getting darker and darker and with each shed. And, I don't really, I'm kind of moving these on. If you want them back, you're welcome to buy them back or whatever. So I bought that male back and then he produced, I kept a few of his offspring females and then, bred him back and a couple hatched out with black eyes and similar to the black-eyed Stimsons. And then they had like pied marks on their tails. And so I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And so This is the third or fourth year of producing these weird, pied-tailed, black-eyed Stimson's pythons. So it's kind of a fun little,
cool.
dingle projects, as they say. But, we'll see how they develop. And I'm hoping to kind of, maybe look at breeding a black eye to black eye and see what that happens. Right. My efforts with the children's line of black eyes hasn't really yielded much fruit. And I don't know, it's kind of a weird thing that it popped up in both species, but yeah, I guess maybe they are closer related than I'd like to admit maybe.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know that necessarily, you think, well, did they just breed the Stimsons and the children's back in the day? Are they mixed and matched or whatever? And that's possible, but I've tried my best to, try to find, Barker lineages or whatever, for whatever that counts, to try to get back and get those pure Eastern Stimsons or children's lines or whatever you want to say. But it's somewhat difficult in the captive setting, especially since all Antaresia were kind of looked at as the same thing back in the day. Everything was just children's pythons. So, but at least since the late 90s, they've been kept separate or kept in whatever form they are. So
it's still a little bit wild, right? That prior to being Antaresia, or at least, and I don't know the whole history of how it goes down through, but if you're looking at books from the 80s, they'll reference them as Liasis, which is interesting.
Like, little Liasis. Yeah, right.
Little tiny Liasis. Okay.
And in form and function, not really Liasis.
Yeah.
Not
very similar really at all.
Yeah. It's funny to think. And apparently they were at one time Morelia as well. So
wow.
When I imported some Western Stimsons from Europe, they had them marked as Morelia stimsoni. And then our U.S., custom Fish and Wildlife wasn't going to let them in because they're like, there's no such thing as Morelia stimsoni. Right. And so they held them. And then actually we had to get the papers from the England side reissued with Antaresia stimsoni before they would release them to me. It was bizarre. So I don't know.
That's wild.
Yeah. Yeah. But they're very cool little snakes for sure. I'm having fun with them and enjoying them quite a bit. So I don't know. I see them as just an important part as people's domiciles get smaller, and they're
right.
It's a little more difficult to keep a retic or even a carpet python in some of these settings. But Antaresia fit in nicely with the apartment or smaller homes. So. They're the python of the future.
Okay.
Well, anything else of note to discuss this week, or are we ready to start battling?
I think I'm good. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, as ever, right? There's a ton of exciting stuff to see or whatever, but I'm sure I'll just bring it up next time. So
or whatever. We can talk about it at the end. I like to kind of throw in there at the end if we've seen anything cool in herpetoculture or whatever. And so I guess we can save it for then. But so today we're going to talk temperatures, humidity, those kind of things in regards to keeping in captivity. Do you try to match what they're experiencing in the wild? Do you get on the weather apps and try to figure out, what's going to, and look for patterns in, the weather to try to figure out what's going to help them breed more efficiently or better or whatever? Or do you just kind of go with the care sheet, set it and forget it, give them an 85 hot spot. The room might go up and down with your seasonality, but you don't really worry about it too much and kind of keep it simple, stupid approach. So those are kind of the two sides of what we'll be discussing today. So let's see. I guess we'll give it a coin toss and see where we land. All right, you want to call it?
Tails.
It is tails. Nicely
done.
All right. Which side would you prefer?
I guess I will. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about really digging into native habitat stuff. So I will advocate for taking a simplistic approach.
Okay. Sounds good. And would you like to kick us off or defer?
I will defer. I will check this.
You'll check me. All right. What up, Chuck, if you're listening? We appreciate the Chuckisms that we've received over the years. All right. So I think one, really nice thing about the technology or, the advances that we've had are the fact that we've got weather stations in a lot of different areas now, and that they're collecting weather data from many different areas. You can even get on and go back in time. I've stumbled across this Weather Underground site, and you can actually go back to 1930. I don't know how accurate or how great those are. And I guess that's one of the caveats, is that sometimes you'll get these things that might put, they'll have a weather station at the airport, and that weather might not tell you a lot about specifically the jungle that your snake came from. It gets you closer than just looking outside and looking at your thermostat in the house or something. But, there is some, question whether or not, how accurate they represent what the snakes in the wild are experiencing. But it's definitely a move in the right direction, gives you at least conditions where they're found, and more and more they're getting more and more accurate. You can actually look in small little towns or locality cities for the species you work with. Now the I guess benefit that I really saw was during writing some of the books. I was trying to make some weather graphs, of min, max, temperatures, average temperatures through the month, and kind of plotting those over the course of a year. And you kind of get a general idea for what these snakes are experiencing. So, surprisingly, I looked for the green tree python book, looking at the weather in where they're generally found. It's pretty stable. It's pretty consistent, so for some species, weather might, or temperature might not be that critical, but for the rainfall, precipitation, that graph went off the charts, in certain months, and was baseline and others. So very little rainfall during part of the year, and a whole heck of a lot of rainfall during certain months. So I think, if, in regards to determining what's important in the environment for a species you keep, these weather apps can be very useful to see what they're actually experiencing and the conditions in those countries. So I kind of lead out with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think from a research perspective, it makes a ton of sense. Like, it's, basically obligatory from coming to understand the creatures and really get a sense for them, right, beyond sort of the care sheet knowledge of that stuff that we're keeping, right? Certainly you as an author are obliged to take those steps, you would think, maybe at least on maybe nowadays, maybe not a TFH book from, you just change the pictures or whatever.
Yeah.
So, and certainly when you're talking about it in that Chondro book context, what it reminded me of is I had done the same thing looking at, I think it was 2 years of daily data associated with Halmahera when I was trying and failing to breed the Halmahera scrub pythons, thinking, okay, is there what can I learn here? And then I even went I guess part of my taking this position would be to say that I actually then plotted on a calendar and tried to make an equivalency let me stop and go slower. So there was very, very minimal temperature. The min-max temperature variation in Halmahera was very small at the weather station, but a weather station that seemed pretty accurate relative to where certainly iNaturalist records are, the Barker story about where they had found the Halmahera python. It seemed pretty accurate, but the min-max range was like the mid 70s to upper 80s, essentially the entire year. There was like 90% of the days fit within that paradigm. There was volatility in terms of precipitation and presumably then ambient humidity. But it wasn't a plain wet and dry season. It was, it seemed like maybe there were 2 or 3 different spikes throughout the year, spikes and valleys relative to precipitation. And because absent a clear pattern that I could deduce from looking at these 2 years of data, what I then did was try and essentially say, okay, how much misting relative to itself? It's not that I can mist an inch of water, equivalent to an inch of precipitation falling, but if I could essentially look at the amount that had fallen, be it 0 or whatever these increments were, and say, okay, well, if it's in this range, I'm not going to spray at all. If it's this range, I'll spray for 5 seconds. If it's this range, I'll spray for 10 seconds. If it's this range, I'll spray for 30 seconds. And I, for a year, literally plotted it out according to what had happened the previous year and sprayed this, again, not saying that it's the equivalent amount of water, but it was a
stimulus,
possibly equivalent rate of change, right? And certainly a stimulus that was associated with that. So there was sort of this incrementation to it. I did see some positive activity, But ultimately, it did not yield, viable eggs.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess all of that is sort of the counter narrative that would serve my point of saying Chuck did none of those things and successfully produced them several times, whereas I put in tremendous effort, overthought, not even necessarily overthought it, but thought through it very intently, came up with this scheme, so based on what I had learned. And that didn't make the difference, whereas Chuck was not doing those things and certainly did have success. So, Chuck, I don't think Shane's doing those things either. I certainly don't think Oklahoma City Zoo is doing those things. So, yeah, it's interesting. So those experiments were happening before anyone had produced them. So all of this is precedent to any of those successes. But, I would toss that out there as saying, hey, I actually really thought about it, tried to then represent that stimuli in my enclosure without success, and all the people then who subsequently have had success they're showing seasonality, I'm sure, in their care, but not to that level of, okay, literally a year ago on this date in Omaha, this is what happened. And I believe I even offset it by, well, is that above or below? It's below the equator, right? So I think I even accounted for the fact that it would be like 6 months inverted. Yeah.
I think, that brings up a really good point. I think a lot of times these weather apps have been more helpful for corrective action rather than trying to match and have it. I guess I can't think of many examples of where people match the natural environment more closely and had better success, other than kind of generally like, if you don't give your colubrids winter cooling, they're probably not going to breed very well for you or have viable offspring, that kind of thing. But I do know of a few examples of corrective actions similar to, the green tree pythons, where people were generally keeping them far too hot, 90 degrees and things. And in their natural environment, they probably were not getting much above 85, or 80 or something. So, I mean, they could still get eggs and they could still have, animals, but they were also having a lot of mortality and things like that. So hopefully, changing from keeping them too hot to keeping them more similar to what they experience in the wild would help them. The other example was actually from the San Diego Zoo. We were lucky enough to get to tour their Tuatara facility, which is not on exhibit. It's kind of privately funded, held, kind of in the back. I'm pretty sure they still have it there, but I haven't checked back in there since we got to see it the first time. But basically what they had is this weather, or at least for temperature, and maybe a little bit for humidity, but they would adjust the temperature depending on the temperature in New Zealand at the time. They might have inverted it the 6 months to account for the different hemisphere, but what the hell is the Southern Hemisphere? No. I love that Simpsons quote. Anyway, they were keeping them kind of based on, zoo protocol, how to keep a tuatara, care sheet, basically the zoo version of a care sheet, I guess, which is probably much more in depth and things. But then they made the switch. They weren't having much success. These animals weren't thriving and doing that great. So they thought, well, let's try to match the environment in New Zealand. And so they got this app and system that would open the windows. If it was a hot sunny day, they would open the windows and allow natural sunlight to come in. And the guy said it was like the keeper that was leading the tour said it was like they finally turned on the heat, and these things ran to the sun and just were basking and like soaking it up. And they thought, oh, if these things get above, 60 degrees, they're going to die. And they were out there basking at, 90 degrees or something. So, I mean, I think, we have it in our minds that we can control these things. And if, we have these preconceived notions like the tuatars, if they got too hot, they would die. Whereas they were just wanting that heat, at least for part of it. I'm sure if they kept them at 90 degrees all the time, they would in fact die. But, having that option to experience some sun and some heat at some part of the day was very important for them. So I think in that regard, it can dispel old notions of how these things work. And I think Frank Reed has talked a little bit about this with monitors, where, back in the day, everybody thought monitors were these, sluggish, lazy things that just kind of sat around your pet store floor, the Savannah monitors of old. And then once he gave them, 130-degree basking spot, which everybody, said that would kill them, it's above their thermal maximum and things like that, but they're not sitting in that for forever. Right. They're moving around and cooling down and things. So going into burrows and, so this is, it's like trying to play, 3D chess in a 2D checker world or something, sometimes, where we can only do so much within a cage, an enclosure environment. And granted, these tuataras were in a building size, like a large greenhouse type enclosure, where they had burrows and they had, different ways to escape the heat if it was too hot or things like that. Whereas if you're in a, 4x2 foot enclosure, you're going to have more limited options, and maybe keeping it simple is a better option in that regard. But I don't know. That's kind of, I guess, corrective action using natural cycles is probably very important to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you make a great point there in terms of when you're talking about the size and space is the texture of the environment, right? The amount of different optionality that the size of the enclosure, even that you're just providing, right? I mean, that's part of the, as you were highlighting, old monitor keeping, right? It's often not with that, the provision of both extremes, right? The ability to be deep underground, deep burrowing, plus verticality, plus, too hot and too cool, and then trying to allow them to access both those things. The monitor thing is bizarre and it must, I don't know, you almost think it has to have come from observations mostly based on non-odatria, because if you look at and see an odatria in the wild, what Frank, Frank was the visionary to perceive that and bring that into captive monitor keeping. But it also makes total sense if you've ever seen a monitor in the wild, right? Like, so it's almost like, how could it's failing to understand how that could have been the sort of common knowledge, a common belief of how to keep them. And I would think it has to reflect like, big water monitors and Komodos or something like that, of like that sort of body form and how they do. They are a little bit more passive. And if they're coming from clouded environments and these sort of things, then maybe they're not often getting too hot in the way that you would see in Central Australia, with an Acanthurus or a Gilleni or whatever, where it's like, it just seems sort of wild that someone would think, oh, exposing them to those temperatures. I mean, heck, even all the lizards we see in Utah. Yeah. Right? If we're talking college lizards, whatever it is, that it's like, why would you think these things don't have to, it's not an essential part of their physiology to really get hot and then to get too hot and then to retreat from it, Yeah. That's it's super interesting. The other thing that I thought that potentially undermined my venture with the recreating the Halmahera misting schedule was going back to our own Pelly conversation. I had no information that previous year was a great year relative to Halmahera pythons. It was just what happened the year before, and again, maybe it's a little less because there wasn't, I did look at 2 years and they were very similar to one another. And there wasn't a huge range of variance there. Maybe that sort of cuts the other way of saying, well, it presumably is just sort of, it's relatively average as opposed to being a bumper year or, the opposite. I know we talked about this a lot in the context of Utah and Colorado last year versus this year being far more normal, as opposed to last year being the weird year. But I suppose that's the other aspect of this too. And maybe it highlights the point that you're making in terms of saying it's more about baselining correctly and making sure we're not fundamentally missing something than it is to say, oh, we got to recreate, Kakadu National Park in 2019 when you're trying to produce home Pelly pythons, as opposed to just saying, hey, our fundamentals need to look like this.
Yeah. And I think too, this can be very instrumental in regards to herping, putting yourself in the place, or, especially if it's, somewhere close where you want to go explore your own state or your own, area, and you're looking at previous observations and trying to see what the weather was at that time. And so sites like Weather Underground, where you can go back historically and look at, okay, this animal was found in 2018 on June 3rd, and I want to see what the weather was doing at that time. And you can look at the weather a few days before and a few days after and say, okay, if there was a rainstorm 2 days before, and so maybe I target a time when there's been a rainstorm and I drive out there, and if the temperatures are over 80 degrees, I'll have a better chance. That kind of stuff. I think that can be very instrumental, and I've actually been using it a bit that way to try to maximize my I guess efficiency, or the time that I'm spending out in the field. I don't want to waste too much time and gas, if that kind of thing, where I'm going away from my family to go look for snakes. Sometimes I'll bring some of the kids or something, but like usually it's me going out with friends or on my own. And so I want to maximize those times and be able to find the targets that I'm looking for. And so I think the weather apps in that regard can be very instrumental and helpful to try to gather data, to make some general assumptions, like, and I guess obviously, reptiles don't always play by the rules. You might find them, doing some strange things that you wouldn't anticipate at times that you wouldn't think were optimal for that thing to be out. And I think we've had experiences like that on our field trips, where we see things, or it's, cold, but, we could just say, oh, let's just hang out in the Airbnb, or no, let's go out and look and see what we can find. And I think, was it who was the guest on NPR that talked about that, where everybody was just kind of hanging out in the hotel, and he said, well, I'm here, I might as well go out and look out in West Texas. And he found a gray band when nobody thought they would be active. And so I like the idea of being able to understand and what they're doing in the wild and their seasonality. And obviously, as the temperatures get hotter, snakes will typically turn to a nocturnal lifestyle, because the temperatures they need to operate are occurring at night, whereas in other times of the year, they might be more diurnally active. So learning those patterns and learning when and where to look, that's part of the fun, I think, of field herping.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I have several thoughts out of this. The first is just, man, we got to export some data and start running some SQL or Python against this to try and like right. All these data sets. It's still massive in terms. Yeah. It's one thing, right? If you're looking at Oenpelli Python records, where there's on INAT, there's 5 or 6 of them. On Atlas of Living Australia, I think the taxonomic changes have caused that to be a little bit problematic in terms of using some of that functionality. Like, I think some of those records have been lost associated with sort of the nomenclature changes there. When I was last looking at it, maybe it's been corrected now, and I did reach out to him about it. But it's a whole other thing, right? If we're talking about, if you're looking at Atrox records in Arizona or whatever it would be, that it's like, man, to plot all of that, then we need the capabilities of SQL or Python, or a language to really kind of visualize all that, or it's just overwhelming. Yeah. But no, I totally agree. And then obviously the other hard part is, if you're pre-planning the trip and we've defined the dates, 6 months out, then you have to hope for the best. You probably will, as long as you don't let it. I think the key is always, as you highlighted there, referencing the gray band story, is saying, like, you got to persevere and keep looking, even when you're the background information and the knowledge that you have maybe makes you not particularly confident in what's going to happen. That's when you need to stick with it, and showing that resiliency is probably the most important thing.
Yeah. And I think too, some species are just more broadly adaptable, or can function under more broad situations. Like, you go out in Utah, you're probably going to see a gopher snake because they are found throughout the state. They're active at a lot of different temperatures and conditions. And so I think, that's kind of the idea is these ones that are maybe more difficult to find, like an Owen Pelly python, you're probably not going to need to plot out all the information on Western Diamondback because they're not difficult to find, and you can go out and see one pretty much, whenever that's the one species you're almost guaranteed to find in certain areas. Whereas something like a mountain king or a milk snake or things like that maybe have a little bit more sensitive, or not sensitive, but like a narrower window of activity, especially surface activity, where you're going to be able to find them. So I think those kind of tools are probably more useful for those type of species. And I think that's what you're getting
yeah,
to.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I think too, in regards to keeping, I always like, Terry Phillips' comment about, well, I'm not shoveling snow into my, rattlesnake cage at the reptile gardens or whatever. And I mean, I think he, uses that kind of humorously. There's some aspects of conditions in the wild. And so I guess the thought is is barometric pressure more important, or is the actual water, the precipitation? And because a lot of times you'll spray animals and they go hide and they do not enjoy it necessarily. And I don't know if it's giving them the stimulus that, that we may think it has, or if it's that barometric pressure that's triggering those changes. So, sometimes when there's a snowstorm, I might go in the reptile room and spray down the animals because they're not, at snow temperatures. They're still much warmer than the outside conditions in northern Utah. But I might utilize that barometric pressure to kind of stimulate, with a little bit of simulated rainfall in quotes, in their enclosures. So they're getting both those stimuli just to hopefully increase my chances, I guess. We're kind of shooting in the dark with a lot of this stuff because we don't have a great idea. And I don't know how you would determine that, if barometric pressure, but I think a lot of observations have been made in that regard where, people see storm fronts rolling in and all of a sudden their pythons are mating, or, these kind of things, or the babies are born when the storm rolls through. And it's like, well, they didn't get rained on, they didn't get snowed on, but they still felt something, in the environment that stimulated that change. So, is barometric pressure more important than the actual rainfall? It's possible in certain situations that that's the case, and likely that that's the case in certain situations. So,
so the thing that jumps to mind, right? Talk about Terry's comment about the snow is like, well, of course you can't shovel in the snow because the cage is not such that it actually has the environment to support the conditions where they could go estivate while the snow is sitting on top of the surface and whatever. So if you had the greenhouse, right, if it was the tuataras at San Diego Zoo and this entire structure to support this, then maybe you could shovel the snow in at the right time of year and encourage that estivation in that way, presumably the temperatures themselves would also be encouraging that behavior from the animals and all that. So the sort of multifactorial nature of all this is super interesting. The other thing that jumped to mind in terms of, as you mentioned, in terms of how do animals react when they're sprayed, it does remind me of our first Australia trip where we had Cyclone Owen came through, Owen had stayed home. And so he sent a cyclone in his stead. So beforehand, right. And obviously we have lots of barometric pressure things before it had made landfall. And the day or two beforehand, we saw 2 gelatin carpets that were out and about. Once the rain had actually made landfall, then the only snakes that we were seeing out were scrub pythons. And it seemed, my experience would suggest that scrub pythons don't seem to care if it's actively raining. They'll just go about their business. Mm-hmm. Whereas carpets seem like they don't, which probably fits, right? If we're in this context of saying, what do captive carpets do if you spray them with a mister? For the most part, they try and hide away from that. Scrub pythons seem a a little bit less, more resilient to that, or a little bit less impacted. And so it's pretty interesting. And that was sort of the thought that jumped to my mind when you made that comment.
And what's funny is the first carpet I found in the wild was during a rainstorm. It was out on the road, getting rained on. And I mean, maybe frequency and timing, like if it's the first rain of the season,
right.
when we were herping in Darwin area in 2011, we were rolling in, and it was the tail end of the dry season and some of the first storms. And we saw this storm front rolling through, and we're like, this is going to be, and it was an epic night. We saw all sorts of things out on the road. Now, the rain wasn't very long. It wasn't very, it wasn't raining while we were herping. It just kind of came through, had a quick, rainfall, and then it was gone. So, but man, the animals came out like crazy that night. So I can imagine that, the beginning of the wet season, they're going to be much more active than, most of the way through the wet season. They're just like, okay, enough rain already. I don't know what they're thinking, or if that's, but,
right.
I imagine they're a little more excited at the first part of the wet than the later.
It's more of a stimulus than something to be. Yeah, I guess that the thing that had come to my mind was, okay, and I think, here doing a lot of desert herping, right? Yeah. The association is generally that, rain, especially like, as you say, a rain that either at the beginning of the season, those first rains, or a rain that comes through, but then passes on, right? So put some moisture into the environment, but then even ideally, like it's still not at the end of the day. It's not right into night. It's like, there's still a little bit of time to bring some warmth to that. Those are often great nights, right? Mm-hmm. But like when we went to Florida in the fall, the day that it rained, I forget who it was, and I understand the idea, but it was like, oh, that must have been helpful, and it was like, no, the rain was exceedingly cold, it was dark, and it said, no, rain doesn't always mean good, like, oh, that must have helped, and it was like, no, absolutely not. It was nothing was coming. Maybe some toads, that was about it. And the other thing was just, that I meant to mention there is, so I think rain in the desert is a stimulus, whereas rain in a rainforest, it struck me as being like, well, this is just something to be endured, especially like in the middle of the season, as you say, like if it's not that first rain or the transition point into that season, I think those rainforest animals probably view it as something to be endured rather than it's essential. I'm not saying that it's not essential, but in terms of their engagement with it, it's probably to endure rather than to celebrate it.
Yeah. Well, it's like snow. I mean, the rattlesnakes aren't laying in the snow. They're going deep underground, and are they doing that just because they live in an area where it snows, and so they have to get away from it, of course, or else they're going to freeze. Although certain species can freeze and
bask on the sand. Well,
those pictures of the alligators with their noses out and they're frozen all around them. I'm like, that is incredible nature right there. That they can survive that, or turtles, frozen in a block of ice under the water. It's incredible. So obviously, adaptations and things will dictate where they spend their time and what's tolerable to, like you said, the scrubs are out crawling. They're like, well, I live in a rainforest. There's going to be a little rain. It's not a big deal. Whereas other species, and I think too, like you mentioned, the frogs come out with the rain. So heavy rains can mean a great season if you're really into amphibians, and you need to know that that's going to correlate, and that's important. We had a lot of rain around here, and I was driving. I think I was taking one of my kids' friends home or something, and then I noticed all these frogs jumping across the road. So I'm like, well, I'm going to go out herping, and I found tiger salamander and a bunch of northern leopard frogs and things like that. So good times. A few snakes were out as well, and maybe chasing their prey.
Snakes coming out to exactly. Right. So
it just depends on a lot of things. It's a very complex thing, and to try to boil that down into a 4x2 enclosure can be challenging for sure. So you do need to, and maybe this is going to your side, you do need to kind of boil it down to what's critical and what's important. And I think, that's kind of what is the impetus for a care sheet, or, here's what the basic requirements are. This is what you absolutely fundamentally must hit on, or else you're not going to have success with the species. And I appreciate that. But I guess as we look at it in regards to herping, or in regards to maybe increasing our cage, or, room size, or greenhouse caging, outdoor
more
caging.
Options.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I know, I had a couple conversations with Bert Langworth, and I was kind of new in at least the breeding side of the hobby and things like that. And I talked to him on the phone because I really was into Australian water dragons. And I was thinking, and he's like, oh, I'd really recommend keeping things outdoors. And I'm like, I'm in northern Utah. I can't keep anything outside. He's like, what are you talking about? There's this species and this. And he's like rattling off all these different species that would do well in my climate. And half of them I hadn't even heard of or knew,
right.
If they were even,
are these available in the U.S.?
Exactly. And so, I mean, I just saw that passion of like, no, you live in a place where there are reptiles, and reptiles are around the world, are found in similar environments to your state. And so, with a few modifications of an outdoor cage, you can be very successful at keeping, just make sure you throw a tarp over it when the snow's coming, things
right.
like that, where it's doable. You just have to put in the work, put in the research, put in the effort to design a cage where they will be successful. And he said, most certainly you could keep Australian water dragons outdoors in Utah for the majority of the year, if you design their habitat appropriately in your yard. And so that's always been in the back of my head, because it is kind of a fun thing to have an outdoor caging. And I'm always jealous when I go visit my friends in Australia and they have all these outdoor pits and monitors outside and stuff. But of course, there's also the challenges that are associated with that.
Absolutely.
Weather is extreme and nature is brutal, and it's very difficult. Maybe I'm a little more of a control freak when it comes to, my precious animals.
Right.
But, that can be a challenge as well to keep them outdoors.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the question with that really comes down to, so if we're talking about keeping stuff inside and trying to replicate those conditions, highlighting again my, again, I wouldn't call it misadventure with the Halmaheras. They did fine. They did great. Yeah. It just didn't have the success that I was hoping it would. But in terms of just successfully managing them, it seemed no different than when I was just sort of arbitrarily doing it. I just didn't notice a different change there. But obviously the limitation, we have a resource limitation in terms of the products that exist, when we're talking about indoors, and how can we do that, right? Do we have the capacity to, modify the barometric pressure? For the most part, no, right? And in terms of an average person in their house, probably not. We can, as you said, sort of what we can do is try and align it and take advantage of when that happens, right? Which is what you're highlighting totally. And in the outdoor context, I think it is, like the point Bert's making there is like, hey, I think his vision was a willingness to utilize and support that sort of the natural resources that exist, like natural resource conditions, right, that exist. That was really his vision, was saying, okay, how can I make these things work in this space? What can I do to, based on the conditions that I have here, what's the directionality of the cages, as you highlight, right? Like, okay, if we need to account for where the sun is, and I probably don't want to be putting them on what for us would be the north side of my structure, right? Because if I'm trying to give them active basking, then for the most part, that's not the ideal place, right? Instead, a southern exposure would be preferable. I presume in the southern hemisphere, it's inverted, so that actually the northern exposure is the ones that you want, whereas that southern one would be the disfavored position. So just making sure we're thinking through all of those complexities and making sure we're supporting it, absolutely. Then I do think, obviously, the ability to utilize the sun, just if we're talking about fundamental heating questions, right? Like the ability to utilize and maximize what we're getting from the sun. The sun is the ultimate, overdue, so it's like the question is always, it's more about utilizing it, but moderating it, again, depending on where you live, right? Certainly at elevation for us, it's very much, we have to utilize it, but make sure we're not overdoing it. And it even reminds me of the old Stanchiris with the
diamonds.
The diamonds, where it's like, okay, and I'm sure the same would have been true. You or I probably could have followed his method and actually done okay, because man, it can be an ambient temperature at 30 degrees, but in the sun it'd be 65, 70, that sort of thing. Like we both experience that constantly every year. You know, there are weeks of that sort of weather where you'd be out. I'll be out in shorts, you know, when it's 30 degrees out and feel great. And then the sun goes down and it's like, oh man, it got chilly. It got chilly quick, you know. Whereas when I lived in Michigan and would do the same thing, you know, I was the crazy person, because you're not at that elevation. The sun isn't the same way, let alone all the cloud cover and all that. So it was very different. But I don't know. I do think you make a great point there. And I think it really is about resource availability. And if we're keeping stuff inside, obviously, then we're confined to the universe that exists and is feasible, you know, is practicable and feasible. Outside, I think that expands our options, just the sun, but then we have to put in so much thought and support. And that's before you even get into other, you know, raccoons trying to eat your water dragons and whatever, you know?
That story that Alan Rapashi told about his shinosaurs, you know, they had like in the outdoor enclosures, and a raccoon just came through and bit the heads off of all. Like, what a tragedy, you know, what a crappy deal.
That's a bad day out.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I remember Ron saying too, when he built those monitor cages, that he planned it based on 1 month, you know, where the sun was, and then all of a sudden they're shaded by this giant tree that he's not going to cut down the tree, but like now he's got these permanent structures in a shaded area for most of the year. And he's like, why didn't I, you know? And so, there's a lot of time to go back to the old drawing board when you're keeping outside. I remember Frank Rita said when he put Odatry outside, that all of a sudden they got really wary and they were very shy, because, you know, they could see the hawks flying overhead, and all of a sudden predators were back, you know, in their mind. Whereas in inside and indoor enclosures, not a care in the world, you know, they were very bold and you'd see them all. Now they all of a sudden, you'd call them, they went crazy, you know, because they were wary of predators and hiding more and things, which that's what they do in the wild. You know, they're not
right.
So they've got to be careful of those things that in an indoor enclosure they don't need to worry about. And I've noticed, you know, those noticeable changes when I would take, like, say, a Rankin's dragon outside, put it in the sun for a few minutes, and all of a sudden it's like, you know, flattening out and gaping at me and trying to, you know, thinking I'm a predator because it got a little sunlight. You know, it's kind of crazy how that can flip their personality.
Yeah.
Kind of along the same lines with the early monitor observations that, oh no, these are great pets. They just sit on your lap, and, you know, give them their appropriate thermal regimen, and they are lightning fast.
It's a whole different thing.
Yeah. They're not going to put up with your nonsense of putting them on. They're going to chew on your lap rather than sit on your lap. So, we need to understand what the reptiles need. And I really think that, you know, understanding them in their natural environment, why they are doing the things they do, definitely adds to our competency of keeping them in an enclosure. Even if we're limited in the resources, if you understand, okay, they come out this time because they need this temperature, or because the rain stimulated them, or whatever, you can hopefully account for part of that, at least in the enclosure, at least the part that helps you keep them happy and healthy and, you know, potentially reproductive if that's the way you're going. So there's a lot of things to be gained from understanding the thermal and hydric, the conditions in their natural environment.
Absolutely. One little anecdote, or, you know, back in my day, tell me about the War Grandpa. During the load in for the Daytona show in 05 or 06. So it would have been like Saturday morning. I was standing in the loading bay, and there was someone there who was holding a very large croc monitor on their shoulder, sort of just like this. And it was like,
he's a puppy.
Okay, he's a puppy. And as we're standing there for longer and longer, waiting as the load in goes, the clouds are parting, the sun's starting to go, and it's like, well, this is going to turn really interesting.
Yeah, he might want to find some shade before that thing takes off or rips him a new one.
Yeah. I was like, I don't know if you're thinking this through. That is probably the ultimate example of what we're talking about, right? Of like, oh yeah, that animal seems like one thing at what is, a suboptimal operating temperature. That thing is an entirely different animal when it's when it's running at 100, let alone 110,
Yeah.
So,
and I mean, it's hard not to see things from our own perspective, to try to see things from the reptiles' perspective, because a lot of times that's very foreign and hard to understand for us. We want to anthropomorphize and we want to say, oh, he likes this or he likes that or whatever, where they could either be freaking out or, just in a state of torpor because they're too cold, so they're not making proper decisions. So, it's easy to kind of go down that anthropomorphism or, seeing things from our own perspective rather than the reptiles' perspective. And again, I mean, as we learn more about what they do in the wild and where they're found, the majority of their time is spent. That's kind of been a little bit of a paradigm shift for me with Woma pythons, is seeing some of the new data that Melissa Bruton is publishing and getting that information and trying to incorporate the things that, I'm learning from that and seeing if that's going to improve their condition in a captive setting. That's definitely worthwhile efforts, I think, to try to improve the way we're keeping these things and hopefully make us more successful herpers as well, and by the same token, the better you understand them in the wild, better you can find them in the wild, and also hopefully the better you can keep them in captivity if that's the route you're choosing. So, well, anything that we didn't hit on that you were itching to get off your chest, or did we kind of cover the thing? I'm sure there's a lot of layers to this discussion and a lot of things that we could potentially talk about. And I'm sure, after we hit stop on the record, we'll think of all these cool things and maybe we can revisit this topic in the future. So if this is something that's you get excited about, listeners, you might want to chime in and see if there's an aspect you want to come on and talk about as well. But fun discussion for sure, and fun things to think about with reptiles. And I don't know, hopefully you got something good out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would hope, as you say, that this is really, I think more than anything, we hit on a bunch of jumping off points that can go in a whole bunch of different directions. So I think going forward, that's, if people want to hear about specific aspects of that, or better yet, come on and chat through it, that's it's certainly welcome.
Definitely. All right. Well, now comes the time for anything cool in herpetoculture that you've seen recently.
So the thing that jumps to my mind is Keith just had a litter of Hog Island boas born, which is very cool. They look awesome. And he has these beautiful animals from Vin Russo that, when we were out his place maybe 3 or 4 years ago out of Keith's place, we had seen them and they were just totally incredible, kind of heavily flecked. All the different Hog Island boas are so neat, both based on how they change colors sort of seasonally throughout the day. But they have, these pinks and almost greens and blues. And then, they have these dark pattern inclusions of browns and blacks and all this different stuff. They're truly amazing, and all in this small little package. So those kind of fit. A buddy of mine, when I was first when I was in high school, I guess, had a pair of Hog Island boas, and he had gone out of town, and I had to go, the female was gravid and was going to have babies while he was away. So I had to go check in on him and all that. And so maybe it just takes me back to that point in time and all that. So that's definitely a particular form that appeals to me. Never had one myself. Maybe that'll change. We'll see. But definitely there's a nostalgia to it for me.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I had a boa as growing up. Of course, I like most people. I had a boa constrictor, as a kid, and enjoyed it for the most part, but not as much as the python. So I think that kind of shifted me towards the pythons. I still appreciate boas. I really, like looking at them. And sometimes I'm almost convinced like maybe I do need to keep a boa or two, but, but then I see that slimy mess after they give birth. I guess the pythons crawl out of the egg kind of slimy too, but I don't know. For some reason, I've just always gravitated towards pythons, but yeah, Keith has he's got some animals that kind of changed my mind on that, but
right.
Yeah. I'd love to see him in the wild too. I was really hoping on the trip down to Costa Rica that we'd see a boa in the wild, and same with Mexico. I'd love to see one of those little desert boas out.
Little angry desert boas.
Exactly. Yeah. That would be very cool. And I guess not so little. And some of those can get pretty good size, at least where we were
further south or whatever. Yeah.
But yeah, very, very cool. I got some, shout out to Dustin Gran. I got some, Ciliaris from him, as well as some Underwoodosaurus millii. I'd never kept millii, and now that I've seen him in the wild, I guess I can justify it. So he sent me a couple of each, and they are just very cool. The Ciliaris are so cool. Those little Stropherus. Awesome. What do they call? I don't even know what their common name is. What's their common name? The spiny-tailed gecko or
northern
spiny-tail? Something like that. Yeah. But very cool species. Very, they like their branches. So I just loaded their cage up with all these different branches going every which way. So it's kind of fun to try to find the gecko. There was, I couldn't find one of them, and I'm like, oh no, did they get out, or is it stuck in something or something? So I put some food in the little insect bowl or whatever, and all of a sudden she comes flying, or he or she comes flying out and nabs a bug. I'm like, oh, you're right there, right where I was looking, right where they were, and now they've kind of set up kind of their preferred spots and stuff. It's really fun to watch those. So they're in my office at work, so that's kind of distracting when I'm trying to work. But it's been very fun to have those. So thanks again, Dustin. Yep.
Awesome.
Good times. And I think he just hatched out some more. He's doing really well with them. He's quite the keeper for sure of lizards, and also he's having success with snakes too. So yeah, quite not just an excellent field herper, but also a very good herpetoculturalist as well. So very cool. And an all around just decent guy. So he's the whole package. Sorry, ladies, he's taken. But yeah. I also got some eggs. I don't know if I mentioned that on here, but I got some eggs from my leaf-tailed geckos, the Amnicola riverine leaf-tails. So hopefully they'll hatch, and I can add another species to another notch in my belt, or however you want to see it. But I'm really excited. Hopefully, I would love to see little baby leaf-tails hatch out. They're such cool, cryptic, weird little geckos. So very fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I need to bring him down in my basement, though. I think my herp room is just a little warm for him. Sometimes I'll find him just kind of hugging the substrate, like it's hot. So spray him down a bit. And I have, fans kind of going through their cage and stuff, but I think it's just gets a little too warm. So I'll bring him down my basement. It stays nice and cool throughout the year. And, for the fact that I was finding those leaf tails out and active at like 50 degrees, 55 degrees. Incredible, just crazy. So I don't know, what an amazing group of geckos. And I think that's, part of their problem with, increasing temperatures and climate change and things is they're at risk because they're kind of island endemics to some extent. They're just kind of stranded. I don't know what the best word is, but they're only found at kind of on these higher mountain elevations, as high as you can get in Australia, I guess. But but yeah, they're potentially at risk if the temperatures get too much warmer. Fun stuff. Well, anything else, or I guess
I think that's great. Enjoy
quick and
your
dirty
adventure.
episode.
Yeah.
We'll thank Eric and Owen and the NPR crew for hosting our little podcast, and hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and we'll catch you again next week for another episode.